In the year 1999, Javed Iqbal went on an unprecedented spree of vicious killings. In 6 months, 100 boys vanished, murdered, and mutilated by the monster named Javed Iqbal. 100 murders, 6 months? How? Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and this is the sickening case of Javed Iqbal. Faisal Razik was a 9-year-old boy who worked in a factory folding boxes to make a living. He had a home, and his parents loved him. But they were also terribly poor. So poor that everyone in their family, including 9-year-old Faisal, had to make ends meet, or they would starve. So every morning at dawn, Faisal would dash down to the factory and work till dusk for what was often a measly wage. Now, you must know that Faisal's case wasn't an exception. It was the rule. Back in 1999, poverty levels in both rural and urban areas in Pakistan were at an all-time high. In fact, the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan estimated that in the 90s, 11 million children had jobs, and half of them were under the age of 10. So while his life might be alarming to you, for Faisal, it was perfectly normal. It remained perfectly normal until the morning of the 9th of July, 1999. As usual, Faisal left home in the morning to go to work. But he didn't return that night, and he didn't return any night after. He was missing. Where was Faisal? His employers told his anxious parents that they hadn't seen him anywhere. His underage colleagues had also not seen him. So Faisal's desperate parents were forced to turn to the police for help. But the police were nonchalant. Go check the house of your relatives, they said. Your child probably ran away. Of course, this wasn't true. Faisal hadn't run away. The tragic truth was, 9-year-old Faisal had been taken by Javed Iqbal. The poor boy was one victim out of the 100 that Javid violated and slaughtered. Ijaz Muhammad was another one of those unfortunate victims. His family called him Kaka, after the legendary Brazilian soccer player. But while Ijaz might have been good with his feet, he was also skilled with his hands. At the age of 13, Ijaz and his older teenage brother were full-time freelance masseuses who roamed the streets of Lahore in worn-out sandals and hung out in the gardens of Manari, Pakistan, cleaning colorful bottles of ointment to draw the attention of customers. They also wore ankle bracelets studded with shiny stones that attracted men who paid for head and shoulder massages. Sometimes, and this was a sickening horror of the job, some of these same men would force themselves on Ijaz and his brother. And it was a cruel trade and a desperate existence. But neither Ijaz nor his brother could have guessed that it was about to take another turn for the worse. In October 1999, 2 boys approached Ijaz and his brother in the gardens of Manari, Pakistan. These boys told the 2 hustling siblings that their boss needed a massage and that he was willing to pay double for home service. Ijaz's older brother remembers following the 2 boys for a short distance through winding paths until they got to a house numbered 16B on Ravi Road. There, they met a short, bespectacled man with neatly kept hair, a calm demeanor, and a limp. Ijaz stayed to massage this man, and his older brother left to find other customers. Unfortunately, the short, neat man in glasses was Javed Iqbal, and Ijaz was never found alive. No one knew it at the time, but the gardens of Maniri, Pakistan had become Javid's hunting ground, and he had 3 teenage boys who helped him carry out his atrocities. 17-year-old Sajid Ahmed, 15-year-old Mohammed Nadim, and 13-year-old Mohammed Sabir. They had most definitely been assaulted and brainwashed by Javid, and they helped the serial killer lure unsuspecting kids to his home, where he took sexual advantage of them, strangled them to death, cut their bodies up, and dissolved their remains in acid before dumping it in a river in Lahore. The number 100 was deliberate. It was the number he had thought deeply about before he chose it. And he didn't stop his rampage until he violated his 100th victim. In late November of 1999, Javid sent a self-incriminating package to the Lahore police office. It contained pictures of little boys and a detailed letter where Javid described excruciatingly how he had assaulted, murdered, and dismembered 100 boys. For some reason, most of the policemen felt like it was a lie, a stunt. It probably read like fiction to them. But in the spirit of due diligence, they paid a visit to the address where the letter was mailed, 16B Ravi Road. When they arrived, Iqbal was at home. But when they questioned him about the letter, he snapped and behaved like he was possessed. When they tried to press him for answers, he pulled out a gun and threatened to shoot himself if they didn't leave. So the police left. They didn't even bother to check inside the home. If they had, they would have found damning evidence, enough to prove that this was no joke. However, by the time the police returned to their station, they not only waved off the case, they dismissed the entire thing as a waste of time. They knew Javed Iqbal well enough. In fact, the police department had a long history of exchanges like these with the man. And that's why when the officer in charge of the courtesy visit was asked for a report, he said Javid wasn't a killer of hundreds of kids. He was a nutcase. And that officer, and probably the entire police force of Lahore, didn't know was that Javid had just finished an unbelievable reign of crimes. And it was his oversized sense of self-importance that was responsible for the letter he sent. Javid was seeking attention, a spotlight on himself and his atrocities. It was the end of the road. This was his final card, and he was trying to send a loud message. So he decided to send the same package elsewhere, to a place where he knew it wouldn't be ignored. Javid sent the same package to the office of the Jang, Pakistan's most popular Urdu language newspaper. A letter in the package described in excruciating detail how Javid lured boys to his house to sodomize them, how he strangled them and dissolved their bodies in acid. He mentioned in sick, twisted details the exact parts of their body he fancied and the date he brought them in. He also documented the name of each victim, their home address, the color of their clothing, and the shape of their faces. And if this wasn't strange enough, Javed Iqbal also recorded the amount it cost him to dispose of his victims' bodies. Everything from the cost of the acid to the cost of transporting their remains to the river. All of this was bad enough, but for me, the most chilling item in this package were the pictures. Photographs of every child he claimed to have killed. He had taken these photographs before he killed them, before they even knew the monster he was. So, each image had the innocence, often confused eyes of hundreds of boys, curiously staring into the camera, most of them smiling, tragically unaware of the terrible fate that lay ahead. This is why it makes no sense that the police didn't take Javid's case seriously. There was just too much in that package to brush it off as the musings of a crazy person. Thankfully, the journalists who received the package were curious enough to carry out their own investigations. If this was real, it would be the story of the century in Pakistan. But if they were going to publish it, they had to go to the house where the package was mailed from. 16B Ravi Road, an inconspicuous house on a dead-end street. But no one was around. The house itself was locked and abandoned. So the journalists scaled a fence and found their way in. The first thing that hit them was the stench. They immediately identified the pungent smell of toxic chemicals hanging in the air. But they hadn't yet familiarized themselves with the other smell that was heavy in the air, the smell of death. It wasn't until they stumbled on several barrels lined up in the room, and it wasn't until they opened one that the smell reintroduced itself, this time more pronounced. There were chopped up human remains within these barrels. One barrel had a torso. Another had a chopped off leg with an ankle bracelet studded with shiny stones. The gravity of the case had begun to dawn on the journalists. They realized they were dealing with the worst case of serial killing in the history of Pakistan. Possibly one of the worst carried out by one man in human history. So the journalists went out of their way to contact the addresses of the boys that Javed Iqbal had extracted from his victims before he brutally killed them. And what they found was chilling. Every address was home to a family looking for a son. This was more than enough for a story. The next day, December 3rd, the front page of the Jang newspaper carried a cold-blooded headline in Urdu: "Claim of murder of 100 kids." Inside the paper was the evidence, the details from the letter, the pictures of 57 confirmed missing boys, and the story of a potential serial killer who was nowhere to be found. This was the story of the century. And as expected, the moment the papers hit the stand, all of Pakistan was scandalized. There was an uproar. The citizens wanted to know how this was allowed to happen in Lahore, Pakistan's second most populated city. The government came under serious pressure internally and internationally. The police were dumbfounded, especially because they had bungled the opportunity to arrest Javid when he was right under their nose. As the search for Javed Iqbal began, 100 mothers mourned the loss of their sons as they cried to anyone who would give them an answer. Who was this monster called Javed Iqbal? Why had he taken their sons? Where was he? There was a heap of children's clothing in the Lahore police station, and a horde of desperate parents were identifying the garments that had belonged to their sons. The police had gotten this heap from Javid's home, but they still had no idea where the man was. A week before, they had taken dragnets to a specific lake in Lahore. In the letter from the package, Javed Iqbal claimed he would take his own life by drowning there. But the police and the parents of his victims needed to see his corpse before they believed him. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, Javid had lied because the police found nothing, even after searching every inch of that lake. Javed Iqbal was alive somewhere. So, they began one of the most extensive manhunts the country had ever seen. But again, they found nothing. Where was he? They knew he hadn't left the country, so where was he hiding? That question remained unanswered until one night, the 29th of December, 1999 to be specific. After a month-long search, a man showed up at the front door of the Jang newspaper. His clothes were torn and dirty. His hair and beard were long and unkempt, and his sandals were worn out. "I am Javed Iqbal," he said, "killer of 100 children." For the next hour, while the police made their way to the newspaper office to take him in, Javid opened up to the journalists about everything, every detail of his crimes, and every detail of his life. Born in 1961 as the sixth of 8 children, Javid had a surprisingly privileged childhood. His father wasn't obscenely wealthy, but they were very rich. Rich enough to own multiple properties, businesses, and land, and rich enough to command the respect of everyone who knew them in their corner of Lahore. The only problem with Javid's childhood was that his father spoiled him rotten. Javid was coddled like a prince. When he was in high school, his father brought him a 200cc motorbike and an entire villa for him to live in. He also set up a steel recasting business for the young boy to oversee. While the business might not have been a bad idea, because Javid was very much like his father and had a talent for business. The villa and all the luxuries that came with it exposed the teenager to a lethal mix of extreme freedom and extreme affluence that set him on a destructive path. Javid had cravings, the urge for sex that develops in puberty. However, Javid's urge was intense. It was a strong, twisted craving for sex that intertwined with his growing sense of entitlement and the endless resources his father had given him. And to make matters a little more complicated for him, he was gay. Gay in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Gay in a conservative family and in a conservative society that viewed his homosexuality as a disease that needed to be cured. Ordinarily, Javid's urges would have been stifled and repressed. He would have to constantly look over his shoulder in fear as he sought to find a partner to experiment with. But you must remember that Javid was extraordinarily spoiled, and his rotten upbringing meant that he didn't feel like anything was out of reach for him. To make matters a little more complicated, Javid also had a mean streak in him. He was deeply manipulative. So in his quest for sex, he resorted to devious tactics that involved baiting and coercing his schoolmates into sleeping with him. It got so bad that at one point, his mates nicknamed him the Boy Hunter. Javid would pack his villa with boys his age and younger, all teenagers, some schoolmates, some strangers. I mean, he was a 17-year-old who had a villa and a 200cc motorbike, all to himself. Even if the impressionable teens weren't interested in having sex with him, they most definitely wanted to be around him. To them, he must have been like a god, a rock star moonlighting as a student. But Javid's appetite for sex was endless. The scores of boys he had around him weren't enough. In fact, judging by the way he treated them, they were just there, on display for his pleasure. What Javid loved was the thrill of the hunt. Javid preferred lovers he got using his devious tactics. His favorite method involved writing letters to pen pals who he met via magazines. Innocent, unassuming teenagers just looking for a friend. Javid would build trust with these pen pals and then request their pictures. After this, he would create a short list of the most attractive boys, who he would shower with gifts and money. Eventually, he would get what he wanted. Sex with the most vulnerable and agreeable of the lot. Unsurprisingly, this obsession with sex became a problem in his family. Their obvious concern was the fact that he was gay. It was a sin in Islam, their religion, a crime in the state, and a taboo in society. They were convinced they had to stop Javid and cure him before it was too late. Surprisingly, Javid's father didn't share their perspective or concerns about his son. In fact, he went out of his way to shield Javid from his family and refused to allow them to interfere with his life. Unsurprisingly, Javid saw his father's protection as a badge of approval and proceeded to immerse himself more in his depraved craze for sex. This would continue into Javid's adulthood. As you already know, Javid's sexual partners didn't mature with him. In his early 20s, Javid continued targeting teenagers and preteens. Javid wasn't just a queer individual trying to be himself in a conservative society. He was an oppressor, a predator whose obsession had matured into a cancer that was about to cause one of the most devastating and controversial events in Pakistan's history. Javid's father might have begun to see the problems during this period, especially because his beloved son showed no signs of settling down. And when the old man tried to initiate the conversation, the young man resisted. He had no intention of marrying a woman. So for the first time, Javid's father joined his family against his son. When the pressure to get married was intense enough, Javid searched for a compromise and found it. He said yes to one of the brides his family proposed to him. A wedding was scheduled, and in 1983, at the age of 22, Javed Iqbal got married. Big mistake. Unknown to his family, the only reason he agreed to marry this woman was because he was sodomizing her underage brother. And as some family members would later recount to the investigators, the boy was the only reason he gave the marriage a chance. By now, the family was becoming aware of who Javid had become. They were trying to maintain the family image. Unfortunately, that illusion would shatter when, a few months after the wedding, the marriage was dissolved. Not long after, Javid would get married once again to the youngest sister of one of his boys. And just for context, girls as young as 14 were married off at the time in Pakistan. So you can make a safe guess that the boy in question was also underage. This marriage didn't last either. After his second marriage failed, Javid's father stopped trying, and his family gave up on him entirely. This was exactly what Javid wanted. Now, he was free. For the next 7 years, the predator sought out and assaulted young boys with impunity. All the while, his family, fully aware, did nothing. And even the community became aware of what he was, but they also did nothing. If you ask me, I would say the reason the community turned a blind eye was because most of the victims were homeless orphans or runaways who slept on the street and who nobody cared for. It wasn't until 1990 that Javid's depravity flung itself on the doorstep of one of the most respected members in the community. Javid had sodomized the 9-year-old son of a respected member of his own community. When the man found out, he immediately filed a complaint against Javid with the police. This was a case that should have been taken seriously, and in the beginning it was. Now, the police were aware of this sick individual. Now he would be taken out of society and locked in a cage, right? When the police arrived at Javid's house to arrest him, he wasn't home. So they did the next best thing. They arrested his father and 2 brothers, holding them as collateral until Javid turned himself in. This wasn't exactly in line with the law. The police were bending the rules here, but they wanted Javid and they were prepared to do anything to get him. Now, you would imagine that Javid, hearing his loving father and innocent brothers had been arrested on his behalf, would immediately rush to the station to give himself up. You would think he would do the right thing. and you would be wrong. Because believe it or not, Javid's father and brothers spent 7 days behind bars. Javid simply refused to give himself up. On the 8th day of his father's incarceration, the frustrated policemen switched techniques and raided his villa once again. This time, they arrested and detained one of his teenage boys. Remember the young boys who he had brainwashed to help him carry out the crimes? When Javid returned to his villa and found his boy was missing, he fought with family members who were there during the second raid for doing nothing to stop the police from arresting his boy. A few hours later, Javid turned himself into the police and secured the release of the boy. Then, he bribed the police and the parents of the assaulted 9-year-old, and that was that. The case was brushed under the carpet, and Javid was a free man. And just like a pig fresh out of a bathhouse, Javid headed back to his sty and dove headfirst into the mud and sludge of his perversion. It didn't take long for him to get caught again. This time, he sodomized the son of a man as rich as his father. And this time, his arrest led to a conviction that saw him spend 6 months in jail. 6 months later, he was out and back to the only life he knew. However, he had learned something. He realized that if he was going to avoid future issues with the police, he would have to build something of a relationship with them through manipulative means. His method of achieving this was by lodging flimsy complaints with them every other day and visiting the station just as frequently. Soon enough, the police knew him well, and soon enough, they didn't want to. In the meantime, Javid was accused of taking sexual advantage of 2 boys at gunpoint. And this time, the elders in his neighborhood decided to take matters into their own hands. Their proposed punishment was public shaming. Javid was brought before a council where he confessed to his crime. Then he signed a document where he promised never to touch another boy again. Photocopies were distributed across the area. Then, Javid was forced to visit 100 shops in the main market in their neighborhood where he apologized for his crime. But you cannot shame the shameless, can you? Really, this was nothing but a ridiculously civil punishment for a ridiculously vile crime. Ideally, Javid should have been either thrown into prison for life or been permanently exiled from the neighborhood, but he wasn't. And I personally suspect it was because of the status of his father in the community. No one wanted to offend the old man by heaping more disgrace on top of the shame his son had already brought to his family. But if that was the case, then goodwill was about to expire. Because not long after, Javid's father passed away. And true to form, despite the fact that Javid had been the bane of his existence while he was alive, the old man left him a sizable portion of his estate, about 3.5 million rupees. Javid immediately began to spend big. He built a large house in Rana town in Lahore. There was a pond, a basement, a swimming pool in the backyard. It was luxurious. Javid also splurged on cars, 4 of them. A 5-door Pajero, a Lancer, a Toyota, and a Suzuki FX. The Pajero was his favorite, and he was often seen in it, driving around town with the boys he molested. Javid was as business savvy as his father, just in a more manipulative way. Because despite the fact that Javid seemed spendthrift, it was strategic. Every item, gadget, property, and vehicle he bought served the purpose of furthering his perversion. Soon enough, Javid came up with the diabolical idea to create a video game store, the first of its kind in the area. He sold his house, moved to a less luxurious residence, and focused on the business. Unsurprisingly, it became a hit in the neighborhood. Word spread to neighboring communities, and soon, hundreds of boys had become loyal customers of his game shop. But you already know what this was all about. Javid would offer them tokens at reduced rates and sometimes allow them to play for free. Then, he would deliberately drop money on the floor and hide, waiting and watching for who would pick it up. Once the money had been stolen, he'd announce the theft and order everyone to be searched. Of course, the thief would be caught. Then, Javid would take the culprit to a separate room where he sodomized the poor kid as punishment. After the deed had been done, Javid would then try to buy his underage victim's silence by offering him the money he stole. But word got around very quickly, and eventually, the elders expelled Javed Iqbal from the neighborhood. It gets tiring from here on because despite the fact that you know where this story is going, you silently wish someone would do the right thing and throw him in jail. or better still, end his problematic existence. But no one did, and Javid moved to a new location in the same city of Lahore, where he continued building businesses with the sole aim of luring in underage children. From an aquarium to a gym, to a school that he touted as the first fully air-conditioned school in the area, Javid just kept having his way. He was a malignant disease that needed to be rooted out. But who was going to do it? What were the police doing through all of this? They knew who this man was. They knew his previous shaming and sentences, and what he had done, and what he was capable of. So why didn't they throw the scum into a jail cell? I already mentioned how he obnoxiously sucked up to them, and I have mentioned how he bribed them, but considering the number of boys he violated, surely he couldn't have bribed every parent and every policeman. You are correct, but there was a problem. Most of the parents that found out didn't go to the police because they didn't want to. The relationship between the people and the police in Pakistan at the time was testy, to put things mildly. No one willingly reported anything to the police. People were scared of them. Corruption was rife, and those who actually reported their crimes were either extorted or treated badly by officers who genuinely didn't give a shit. In Javid's case, his relationship with the police had matured into something mutually beneficial. Javid started a monthly crime magazine where he published the heroics of police officers and established good contacts with the top officials in the department. He even had politician friends. So reporting a man like that to the same police could very easily backfire. Javid was, in a sense, untouchable, and he felt that way, until one fateful night in September 1998. On that night, Javid paid for the services of a 15-year-old masseuse, but halfway through their session, Javid molested the teenager, and when he was done, he fell asleep. Desperate for swift revenge, the traumatized teenager invited a friend to join him, and together, they took Javid to the gates of hell with a beating so thorough his skull was fractured, his jaw was broken, and he slipped into a coma. For 22 days, Javid was unconscious at Lahore General Hospital. During this time, his family helped him settle his mounting hospital bills until he gained consciousness. And even when he gained consciousness, he couldn't walk without assistance for 6 months. But that wasn't the only problem. Javid realized that his family had sold all of his assets to pay for his hospital bills and bail. His house, his cars, his shop, everything he owned had been sold to fund his lengthy recovery in the hospital. No one in his family had spent their own money on him. His life was ruined. He moved in with his aging mother who cared for him. But a few months after he moved in, she suffered a heart attack and passed away. The beating, the loss of his business, and the loss of his parents caused something inside of him to break. Javid needed someone to blame, and that wasn't himself. And after weeks of deep thought, he found what or who he was looking for. He found his target and proceeded to formulate a terrible plan for revenge. My mother cried for me. I wanted 100 mothers to cry for their children. This was one of the many reasons Javid gave to the press for the murders he committed. 100 mothers, 100 boys. In an extremely twisted way, Javid's concept of affection revolved around the material items he showered on the boys he violated. The only thing he felt they owed him was sex. Owed him. As ridiculous as that sounds, this was Javed Iqbal's way of thinking. He believed he loved the boys. Now that a boy that he loved had destroyed his life, and his own deluded belief, caused by the death of his mother, he now hated the boys and wanted to kill enough of them to send a message. Before this plan, the acts he had committed revolved around sexual crimes. He hadn't murdered any of his previous victims. But for 6 months, from June to November of 1999, Javid engaged the services of 3 of his most trusted boys. 17-year-old Sajid Ahmed, 15-year-old Mohammed Nadim, and 13-year-old Mohammed Sabir. Sajid and Nadim were 2 of the boys that lured Ijaz, the masseuse, to Javid's house on 16B Ravi Road. Many of the victims had families. Some were runaways. Some others were just out on errands. And then there were the occasional few that were orphans who had no one to search for them, whom no one even knew they were missing. Of these 100 boys, none was older than 16 and none younger than 6. Javid had every picture of every one of the 100 boys he violated pinned to the walls of his house. And on the 17th of February 2000, as the trial of Javed Iqbal began, those pictures were placed on the desk of the presiding judge. I did it to avenge an attempt on my life by my boys, the death of my mother, and injustice in society. This was yet another reason Javed Iqbal gave to the press for the atrocious crimes he committed. That interview with the press, moments before his arrest, was taped, and it became part of the court evidence against him. There were also the letters, the pictures, the clothes of his victims, 86 pairs of the victims' shoes, and images of the body parts they had found in the vats of acid. And when it came to the witnesses, the prosecution produced 105 of them, including 73 members of the missing children's family. They found the owner of the studio where Javid had developed the photographs he took. They even found the rickshaw driver who had helped him transport the vats of acid for disposal during his 6-month murderous bender. The case against him was so overwhelming. Why on earth was Javid now recanting every confession he had ever made? He was insisting he didn't commit the crimes. I mean, the prosecution had his confession in writing, and a videotape recording of him saying he repeatedly did it. The truth is, Javid was an unremorseful animal, a petulant child who never outgrew his indulgent teenage years in the villa with the 200cc bike. Because after pleading not guilty, the petulant predator became a menace in court. He showed no sign of remorse and teased the judge with silly errands, requests for hot meals, and warm sweaters in the middle of trial sessions. It was clear he believed everything was a joke, especially when he claimed that he had staged the killings as a humanitarian effort to highlight the plight of runaway kids. When the prosecution asked him to rationalize the clothes of children found in his house, he said he bought them from a secondhand market. But parents of the missing boys had identified many of these clothes. There were mothers showing stitches that were unique to their style, along with pictures of their missing kids wearing them. Again, the case against Javid was undeniable. There was no doubt that he committed the crimes, but the case had become a global affair, and the international community was watching. Javid knew that nothing illegal could be done to him during the trial. At some point, he even felt he could beat the case. Why? Because the police had bent the law themselves in their bid to bring Javid to justice. During the manhunt, a friend of Javid was taken by the police for interrogation when he suddenly jumped from a third-floor building in the police station to his death. This was the police account of events. When an autopsy was conducted, there were signs that Javid's friend had been tortured. Meanwhile, during one of the proceedings, Javid's lawyer claimed before the open court that someone powerful had approached him to abandon the case. If this was true, there was a conspiracy at play. If it wasn't, Javid's lawyer perjured himself to gain an advantage in court. No one knew what was true or false. However, Javid's lawyer stayed with the case till the end. Another argument for Javid's innocence was why none of his neighbors had said anything when one teenager after another vanished into his house. It was a reasonable argument, but it lacked legs, because if the judge was going to consider the chance that Javid was innocent based on that premise, the defense would have to have had proved that at least one of the missing 100 boys was alive, and they couldn't. And so, after a month of a rigorous trial process, the judge found Javid guilty. He ruled that Javid and his oldest accomplice, the 17-year-old Sajid, were to be hanged at Maniri, Pakistan, the same garden where they lured in most of the boys. And he ordered that their bodies be cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid in front of the families of the victims. While this might seem like a fitting sentence to you, it was an emotional sentence that violated Islamic tenets and a couple of human rights laws. The Pakistani government condemned the sentence and deemed it unconstitutional. It was amended, but the death sentence stood. His accomplices were given lengthy sentences, and they were all sent to maximum security prison. But even in a maximum security jail, Javid's bloated sense of worth and entitlement persisted. In fact, his admission of innocence took a religious turn. He told one visiting journalist that he was chosen by God for a special purpose. He told another that he intended to appeal his case and that he had NGOs lining up to defend him, which was not exactly true. Whatever was going on through his evil skull would eventually come to a screeching halt a year after his conviction. Javid, along with one of his accomplices, were found dead in their cells. They had used their shirts to hang themselves. This was the police report. When the autopsy was conducted, there were signs of torture. Javid's family was convinced that he was killed because he had tried to reveal the names of top government officials within the Pakistani government who slept with his boys, Jeffrey Epstein style, just without the island. However, there is a more plausible alternative for the skeptics. 4 days before Javed Iqbal was found dead in his cell, the country's highest Islamic court had agreed to hear his appeal against the death sentence. Thanks for tuning into Twisted Minds. That was the case of Javed Iqbal, and why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.